Hi guys, this is Mimi. This is my week 3 presentation for Daniel Robichaud's Ecology, Technology, and Sociology class. The essay I chose to work with was Naomi Klein's Let Them Drown, The Violence of Othering in a Warming World. I chose this essay because I've been a fan of Klein's for a very long time. My mom got me into her at a fairly young age. And then uh, I also was intrigued by her use of her mention of Edward Said, which is kind of what the entire, well, it was a speech first. What the entire speech was based around was Edward Said's concept of othering, which is drafted in his book Orientalism. And as a literature major, I worked quite a bit with Edward Said in lit theory. His concept of Orientalism is used quite heavily in it in lit theory. And what other or Orientalism or the othering concept is basically that we dehumanize people that are not like us, and it makes us easy to eschew their needs or fetishize them or objectify them, which is what, when I worked with it in lit theory, it was a lot of the fetishization and objectifying of Eastern cultures, especially like geishas and women of Asian origin. But the concept is very broad, and it's basically any time that we take a culture, it's usually Eurocentric, white people, um, belittling, dehumanizing a culture of color usually. And it lets us do some pretty awful things because we just stop thinking them as humans. They're not like us. Makes this hard to empathize with them. We've heard this rhetoric very recently, calling people trying to escape violent circumstances animals. And this is what this entire concept is about. So when she looks at Said, she talks about how, she uses the phrase that he is no tree hugger, because he sees environmentalism as a luxury. It's an indulgence. If you are starving or fleeing violence, the last thing on your mind is how the trees are doing. So he saw environmentalism as a luxury. Actually, she goes into more though that it's not necessarily that, because he was Palestinian, and in Israel they were doing a lot of what she calls green colonialism, where basically the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, Jerusalem, I think it's Jewish National Fund, was basically they're buying trees and trying to green the desert, but they're essentially erasing Palestinians and the Palestinian culture while they're doing it, and they refuse to lease or sell land to non-Jews. So Said had a very bitter point of view when it came to environmentalism. And also that goes with the green colonialism is, people, they were taking land for carbon offset, and so conservation groups would come in and say, this is ours now, this is for carbon offset, this is for the planet, but then they were also making indigenous people were being attacked for being on their own land, for using their own resources. So there's a lot of, with everything, there's good and bad. So a forest was suddenly rebranded for carbon offset, and so it was put off limits to its traditional inhabitants, is a quote from Klein. But Klein's argument is that Said's concerns do not conflict with ecological issues, and in fact, the crises of refugees and victims of war and corrupt governments interconnect with climate issues. As we saw earlier in Jared Diamond's essay, The Last Americans, you can't have one without the other. Klein argues that it's very important that we tree huggers pay attention to Said. And so due to the rapid rise in sea levels, due to climate change, many people are losing their ability to stay home. And this will only get worse. So this is where Said and Klein intersect. She's saying that yes, the people in these countries that are being ousted and are being inflicted with violence, they don't have time to think about the environment. But we environmentalists need to pay attention to their plight and Saeed's, because the, the reason they're being ousted is because of these climate issues and environmental issues. Um, so Klein mentioned Saeed's popularization of the Arabic word samud. Samud, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong and I apologize, which means to stay put, to hold on. And the quote, she has a quote that says, "The steadfast refusal to leave one's land despite the most desperate eviction attempts and even when surrounded by continuous danger." So there are a lot of cultures that are refusing to leave their homelands because they have climate issues, even though they know it's coming. She lists quite a few examples: Hebron, Gaza, Louisiana. As you can see, after Hurricane Katrina, we just had Hurricane Barry. It wasn't as bad as we were expecting it to be, but there's tons of people that refuse to leave. The Pacific Islanders, Marshall Islands, Fiji, Tuvalu. These people refuse to leave, and even if they did, climate refugees aren't currently recognized under international law, which is kind of insane, since climate refugees because of climate is one of the top reasons that people have to leave, but they're not recognized. And so this is where Saeed's othering concept comes in. If cultures are dehumanized, they're easier to ignore. Calling people animals, as I mentioned. Suddenly we can't empathize, and violence is justified. So climate change is a direct result of Orientalism, of othering. Because if we empathized with these cultures and saw them as humans, as equals, we wouldn't be destroying their environments. We as mentioned in the Story of Stuff video in the first week, we get all of our stuff for our, all the stuff that we consumed is from someone else's land most of the time. And the reason we're not doing it here, for the most part, is because we know these people. They're not others. We have to think about it if it's in our own backyard. We have to look at it. If it's in someone else's backyard and we don't care about those people, then we're not even going to think about it. We're not going to care. We're just going to keep buying our iPhones and all of our flashy gadgets that we in the first world are basically stealing from the third world. And so when we other, it makes it a lot easier to do this. So our othering allows us to justify laying waste to these areas, and it is the destruction that is killing the planet. So this is why our othering and our ability to other is a direct cause of climate change. Klein calls these areas sacrificial zones. And actually, it's not just her. Scientists advising the government up until the 70s called parts of the country where the environment and its people were put at risk for extraction and consumption purposes, national sacrifice areas. So it was even in the jargon, in the laws, in the paperwork. And then usually these areas are Black and Latino neighborhoods in our own backyard. The backwoods hillbillies, Native American land. These are the type of places that are sacrificial zones. Actually, I just moved from Long Beach, which is Port of Los Angeles is right there. And the air quality is the official worst in the nation. The American Lung Association came out with their study last year. It is the worst in the nation. And it's a bunch of poor people. My neighborhood was almost all people of color. Autism rates, my friend is an autism specialist. She says it's some of the highest in the country is right there. And it's funny that people are finally starting to talk about clean energy in the ports, or clean fuels, and getting these ships to lower their carbon emissions, and the trucks, because you have the trucking freeway that gets, I can't remember the percentage of how much of our nation's goods come through that port, but it is most of it. And they're finally starting to talk about lowering carbon emissions there, because the area, I've noticed, is becoming gentrified. So suddenly the rich white people move in. There's like 4 coffee shops on the block that I was living now suddenly. They all popped up at one time, which is a surefire sign that you're being gentrified. And suddenly, lo and behold, white people move in and they're talking about cleaning up the ports. But sadly, all of the people of color in my neighborhood are being ousted because they can't afford it anymore. So our homeless rates went up 16% this year. And so it's just this really hit close to home, this fact of the sacrifice areas. And then seeing it become gentrified, suddenly it's being talked about as not a sacrifice area anymore. Um, so there's also internationally fossil fuel sacrifice zones. Those are in the Niger Delta where they deal with constant oil spills. There's the Canada in Canada the Alberta tar sands, and this is where a lot of Native American issues come into play. We do it in our own country a lot. We've broken every treaty that we've ever had with the Native Americans in our country. And so Canada is pretty much the same. They destroyed treaties with First Nations so that they could get to the Alberta tar sands. Um, and then she also talks about the abuses Canada inflicts on the Indigenous communities there, just as we do here. But she connects it also to there is a very high volume of murdered Indigenous women, and she relates it to them fleeing these sacrifice zones. Canada's Indigenous population, the violence of women, and how many women are missing and murdered is pretty outrageous. So one of the most interesting observations that I saw in Klein's speech, and it was something that hadn't occurred to me before, was that she says, we often hear climate change blamed on human nature, on the inherent greed and short-sightedness of our species. But this mode of thinking lets off the hook the systems some humans created, capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, while disregarding other systems that are eco-friendly and forward-thinking. So usually we think of systems and systemic stuff as bad, especially married with human nature. Human nature's bad, systems are bad. But when we say that it's just human nature, we also are completely ignoring the fact that there are humans out there that have systems that have worked, systems before capitalism, colonialism came along that honored. She mentioned cultures that plan 7 generations ahead, making sure that you're giving back to the land, and these, especially Native American cultures, these systems existed before the Eurocentric capitalist systems came along. So human nature doesn't quite cut it. It's a certain kind of human that is doing this stuff. So I thought that it was a new way of thinking of things, and it was a little bit more hopeful than I'm used to. So one of the big reasons othering is a prevalent practice is because we run off of fossil fuels. Our whole country, we wouldn't be able to function without fossil fuels, especially since in most of our cities here in America, everything is so spread out. We have to use gas to get to our jobs, to pay for our food. Fossil fuels have become we're very dependent on fossil fuels. And so most of these fossil fuels are on foreign soil. So this is why we spend time and energy dehumanizing Arab and Muslim people, because all of our oil, well, most of it, is under their soil. And we won't feel bad about taking their oil or killing them for their oil if they are other. If they aren't human or they're seen as violent or bloodthirsty. We spend a lot of time saying that they're a violent culture or violent people so that we won't feel bad about, retaliating if it comes down to it. Then it becomes easier to wage wars and stage coups when they get the crazy idea that they should control their own oil in their own interest. And she gives 2 examples of this, like in 1953, Britain and the U.S. The overthrow of Mossadegh. Did I pronounce that right? Mossadegh, I think that's how you pronounce it. When he nationalized the Anglo-Iranian oil company, and we said no. And then the most recent was 2003 with the illegal Iraq War. So to compound matters, the Israeli architect Eyal Weizman noted that countries along the aridity line in the Middle East and North Africa, which is where there is 200 millimeters of rainfall every year, are not only stricken with severe drought, obviously because they have such slow rainfall, but we also, this is where we have the most drone strikes, is all along the aridity line. And so, like in Syria in 2011, 1.5 million people were displaced because of the drought and because of civil war, which, as we saw in Jared Diamond's essay, The Last Americans, usually where drought is, civil war follows. So these people on the aridity line are the victim of frequent drone strikes. So they have issues with oil and water. And then this is violence that results in refugees fleeing their homes. And so the same othering rhetoric that allowed us to attack these countries, to take their oil, to deplete their resources, now allows us to vilify the migrants crossing the border. Suddenly they're invaders and are violent or barbaric, and sadly, the whole situation that got them in this is us depleting their resources. These othering tactics are being ramped up now throughout the U.S. and Europe and Australia. Migrants die in detention, and most people don't bat an eye. Why? Because they're not like us. They're other. They're animals. And then the sad thing is too that the rich don't think they think they're going to be okay. That's another reason why the othering becomes so easy, and the reason we don't think about climate change is because it's over there. It's not us. It's not going to happen to us. The poor will take the brunt of it. We can buy our way out of it is a popular way of thinking these days. And it's true, the poor will be hit first. But, just because you climb to the top of a sinking ship doesn't mean you're also going to drown too. It's just going to take you a little bit longer to get there. A recent example of othering on a mass scale, and of this Eurocentric, rich, white way of thinking how we're not going to be affected by climate change was in the Paris Agreement itself. Africa called the Paris Agreement a death sentence because we decided that 2 degrees Celsius was fine. But they say their slogan there is in Africa 1.5 to stay alive, because anything over 1.5 and it's going to get too hot, it's going to get unlivable. And everyone else during the Paris Agreement, all of these European countries and America, were saying, oh, we can do 2. It's like, well, you're not thinking about all the countries that is a death sentence to. And so it's like they had already written them off as others. They didn't even think about these countries that were being affected by the way that this agreement was written. And then they changed it. They put like an addendum, but it isn't binding. So then, where did it go? We saw in the Story of Stuff video in week 1, we're on a linear system on a finite planet. So eventually resources are going to disappear, which means that the sacrifice zones are getting closer and closer to home. An example of this is there's fracking in Great Britain. We have some, oil fields that we're trying to open up. There's always a battle about the Arctic. There's also Alaska. That's our backyard. And then in Canada, the Alberta tar sands. So they are getting closer and closer to home. So people are going to start realizing all the effects of this stuff. It's just taking longer because when it's in someone else's country, someone else's land, and the people you don't care about, it's a lot harder to take these concerns seriously. An example Klein used, though, of things starting to hit home for people was the British floods in December and January of, I think it was 2015, where 16,000 homes were flooded. And locals were asking, why are we spending money on refugees when we have issues here? So it became this whole political, fuel for this, political stuff, when, Klein's arguing that it shouldn't have been a political thing. It should have been a wake-up call that everyone is affected. it's not just people in other countries, that it's going to be coming home, coming to our shores very soon. But instead, they turned it into another way of othering. And I like that she points out that, when people are like, why are we giving money to these refugees when we've got problems here? And it's like she points out that the colonialist nations are usually the direct or indirect cause of the refugees. And, England was the source of these problems. That's why people were coming over. Our fossil fuels, our phones, the inventions that we've created that have destroyed so much of the planet. So we've depleted those resources. But when they come here saying, help us because you depleted our resources, we say no. So instead of realizing climate change doesn't discriminate, they used it as a excuse to discriminate. So the most important lesson to take from all this is that there is no way to confront the climate crisis as a technocratic problem in isolation. It must be seen in the context of austerity and privatization, of colonialism and militarism, and of the various systems of othering needed to sustain them all. That's a quote from Klein. So we need to stop compartmentalizing issues as a race issue versus an economic issue versus an environmental issue, because all are connected and all are causing the other. So we have to meld movements, is Klein's argument. Climate change can accelerate social ills as it is right now, but it also can act as a combatant, it's inspiring people to work together. It is the essential existential crisis of our time, of possibly humankind, and so if that doesn't motivate people, what will? She mentions that Said, right before he died, he found hope and was encouraged by the fact that, as he called them, there were alternative communities across the globe cropping up. So that's what we got to do, is be part of these alternative communities, and keep educating ourselves to realize that all these things are interrelated. And the planet is just going to keep getting smaller and smaller if we don't do anything about it. So that is my presentation. Bye, guys.